Hi, I'm Jonathan Fields, and this is a Good Life Project. So my guest today is Adam Alter, who is the author of a really interesting, funny, insightful book that'll surprise you in a lot of different ways called Drunk Tank Pink. Also a professor at NYU, and somebody who's had an international journey with his life. So we're going to kind of take a step back and then dive into some of the really fun explorations around the book. So awesome to be hanging out with you today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So as people can, I'm sure, immediately hear from your voice, you're not a native New Yorker.
No, I'm not. I've been here for 4 years. I was born in South Africa, and then when I was 7, I moved to Australia. I was there till I was 23, and I've been in the US for the past 10 years or so.
So, which is always fascinating to me, because when you have somebody and you've bounced to literally 3 different major cultures now.
Yeah.
How is it sort of like adjusting to living in these different places and to the way that people behave or don't behave, or what you're supposed to do and not do?
It's very interesting, and I think a lot of my research has been informed by that experience.
Yeah.
And when you look at my teacher ratings, one of the most common comments is, Professor Alter is funny because he's still trying to work out how American culture works. So they seem to pick on that a lot. And it's been an interesting journey, but I feel like I'm starting to get New York after 4 years. I'm starting to understand it a bit better.
Yeah, well, I've been here for pretty much my whole life, so I'm just starting to work.
You're just starting there,
myself too. No, I know. Where were you in Australia?
In Sydney.
Right.
Yeah, beautiful city.
So, and what made you actually make the jump to here?
Well, I was working in a lab there, and one of the professors was an American, and he said to me, I think what you should do is do your PhD in the US. And because of the way the academic schedules work, I had about 48 hours to make the decision. And I decided at the very last minute, that I would try to apply and see what happened. And I was accepted to a program in the US. And so I moved a few months after that, and I've been here ever since.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, to make a decision like that in such a short period of time.
Yeah, it was a big decision, and I made it very fast. And I think one interesting question is whether it would have been a different decision if I'd had more time to ruminate and think more about it. And I felt that I let fate take over because I didn't have much time to decide. I said, I'm going to apply, why not? If I get in, I can then decide whether I want to do it. But each incremental step along the way, once I was accepted and so on, it felt like something else was carrying me along. So I wasn't really making the decisions voluntarily. I was just kind of carried along, but it all worked out well, and I'm very happy.
All right, so that immediately brings up something that's kind of interesting to me, which is this sense that you're fundamentally a researcher, a scientist, professor. And then you just used the phrase, it felt like fate was carrying me along the way. It's like the universe, this thing out there.
Yeah.
You don't normally hear people who are sort of like science and research based saying, okay, it's happening within the context of some bigger determinism or something like that.
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to take it in too spiritual a direction,
Right.
but it's interesting because I studied decision making, and one of the common jokes is that whatever you study is the thing that you're weakest at. So I think my decision-making processes naturally are probably not very sound. I let things like fate carry me a little bit further than perhaps they should. And so I'm very interested in decision-making and how we can improve it, how we can be more systematic about it. And that's a part of what the book is about. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, the last book that I wrote was, when I was doing the research on it, it brought me back to 1961 to Daniel Ellsberg and his sort of like classical, the Ellsberg paradox of why people make decisions or don't make decisions in the face of uncertainty.
Right.
And it's just amazing how we're wired, because so often the assumptions that we make about being logical, about why we do what we do, it's completely not true.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a useful and comfortable fiction to believe that the stuff we're doing for a good reason, and we're carrying ourselves through life with, I don't want to go too philosophical, but with free will. And I think at least what the book is about at least 9 different things that shape us without our control, without our awareness. So I agree with you completely. It's fascinating that people feel that they have that free will and that volition when perhaps they don't.
Yeah, and I guess it's a construct that makes us feel like, to a certain extent, it gives us enough level of comfort so that we feel like we can keep taking action.
Yeah.
And not just become paralyzed because, just saying, it doesn't matter what I do, the world is going to control me.
Yeah, I think that's why I say it's a comfortable fiction, because without it, I think we'd be paralyzed in some way. If you believe that most or much of what you're doing isn't what you mean to be doing, I think that's really quite disturbing, and it might slow people down and stop them from doing, as you say, the things that they need to do to get to where they're going.
Yeah. So let's kind of dive into the book because we've got a lot to talk about here under those 9 different things. I want to go into each one of them and explore a little bit of the idea and a story or two, because some really funny, interesting stuff around them. So talk to me first about this framework of 9.
Yeah, so the book is basically about the forces in the world that shape us without our awareness. And I broke it down into 9. There are many more that I don't touch on, but I touch on 9. And I break them further into 3 separate sections, going from the narrowest ones to the broadest ones. Right. So the first section that touches on three of those cues is on the world within us. So that's stuff that resides within your head, information like the names you give your children or a company, or the labels that we use to describe certain concepts, the linguistic labels, the words we use, the symbols that are attached to certain concepts. All of that stuff doesn't rely on other people or other situations beyond you, but it's stuff that resides in your head and then influences how you think and feel and behave. So that's the world within us. The world between us is a broader world, and that's the world between people. And so there's culture, the presence of other people. For example, do we think differently in the presence of other people? Are we more effective or less effective at the tasks that we're trying to complete? And then the broadest one beyond the world between us is the world around us. That's the physical world, the weather. So it looks like it's going to rain today. Is that influencing us in some way? The colors around us, and that's where Drunk Tank Pink, the title, comes in.
Right.
And the locations that we're in, the size of the location, the nature of it. Does it feel oppressive? Are there a lot of other people in the location? That sort of stuff.
So can we go through each one of them and
Sure.
explore a little bit? So let's start out with sort of like that first triplet of the world within us.
Yeah, so I start by talking about names. I think names are particularly fascinating to me, and a lot of my research has been focused on names. I'm very interested in how different features of names influence outcomes. So one factor that I've studied is known as fluency, which is the ease with which you can pronounce the name. It doesn't just apply to names. I mean, lots of different kinds of information fall along this continuum from very easy to make sense of to very complex.
Right.
But names vary that way as well. So when you come across a name, the way we test this is imagine that you're at, say, the Oscars, and you're opening the envelope and you have to pronounce the winner's name. How easy is it to read that person's name? And then does that have any implications for their outcomes in life? And
Right.
we've shown that it does in some surprising ways.
Which is bizarre because you would assume it's just a name.
It's just a name. And so maybe when you first meet the person, just for the first couple of seconds, you get your head around the name and then off you go, and then you have an interaction. The name should be irrelevant, but we've shown that over a 15-year period, people in law firms are more likely to rise up the legal hierarchy to partnership more quickly when they have simpler names. So beyond the first 5 seconds, we're talking about a period of 15 years, and even beyond that, that you can shape outcomes, or outcomes are shaped by this factor that seems like it shouldn't play much of a role at all, but it really does.
So when you're thinking about if you become a parent, you're thinking about naming your kids.
Yeah,
I mean, should you just give them the name that resonates with you, or name them after somebody who's passed and you want to attribute, or should you have an aunt that's passed away who's got like a 5-syllable name that nobody can pronounce? Like, do you do that and then ruin their career?
Yeah, right. Well, this is the tussle, right? You've got all these cultural factors that weigh in. Like you want to use Great Aunt Mildred's name or some name from way, way back in the past because that's just what your family has done for years. How do you weigh that against all these other factors? There are other factors beyond this though. For example, names and words have symbolic value. So you imagine an image when you hear a lot of words. So there was some classic research done in the 1930s looking at the words Maluma and Teketi. So if I told you that one of these shapes was rounded like a cloud, is it Maluma or Teketi? 99% of people say Maluma is soft and rounded like a cloud. Teketi is much more jagged and hard-edged. And so certain sounds are stronger, more masculine, some are softer and more feminine, and we often name, maybe unwittingly in that direction, we name boys with these harder names or stronger names or more masculine names,
right,
and girls with the more...
So I guess the question that comes to my mind then is, does the individual live into the name, or does which direction does it go?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a tough thing to study. There's a lot of evidence that the name does shape outcomes. So there have been some studies done looking at, for example, the racial nature of a name. So some names are more typically white, some are more typically black. And some economists did some research where they sent a whole series of different job applications varying only the name or the gender of the name. And they found that for the strong applications, the ones that had a white name attached to them were 50% more likely to receive a response. So there you can see very clearly that the name is driving the outcome. There's also some argument that, that there's something known as nominative determinism, which is the idea that your name drives your outcome. And that hasn't been studied as carefully and as extensively by scientists, but it's a compelling idea. So we know Usain Bolt. Bolt is the fastest guy in the world.
Right.
If he'd been named Usain Plod or something, Usain Tortoise, would he have been a different guy? And maybe not, but these are sort of fun and interesting things to think about.
Right, because I guess it'd be incredibly hard to reach, because you'd have to start following people.
Yeah.
Literally from birth, and then how do you control that anyway?
Well, the only case I know where that's been done is with a pair of twins who are named Yes and No.
Oh God.
Which it's one of the cruelest natural experiments of all time.
What evil parents, I mean.
It's a terrible idea, but No actually ended up doing much better in life. So maybe No overcame hardship, but that's obviously a sample size of just one. That's one case. But it is, as you say, very hard to run careful, controlled experiments on this sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I know also sort of in the world of authors, a lot of authors, when they actually become authors, a lot of them think about, do I keep my name? Do I change it the way, like do I, like start to use my middle name?
Yeah.
What would sort of present me as being more serious and taken more seriously in the literal world? And do people buy books from, like a male name versus a female name, or just initials versus the whole name?
Yeah.
And so I know a lot of authors will actually manipulate their names when they actually become authors and say, this is the career I want and this is the brand that I want to establish for it.
Right.
I wonder if in some way that changes the way that the author brings themselves to the world at the same time.
Yeah, it may. So it may be interacting in all sorts of ways. So, people have strong lay theories about this stuff. We all have theories about which names are best, which ones work, which ones are appealing, which makes this an interesting area to study, because whenever I tell people about it, they all have theories and ideas. Yeah. But you're right, it could be that once you change your name, you then end up living up to whatever that name implies. Or it could be that the kind of person who chooses that name is likely to behave in certain ways. Yeah. So it is tricky to isolate the effects sometimes.
Yeah, fascinating though. It's interesting because my daughter's name is, we spelled it. She's a name that would be a girl's name, but we spelled it the way that the same name spelled it, the way a boy would spell it.
Oh, interesting.
Is spelled. Yeah. So now I'm thinking about, okay, what has that done or not done?
Well, I have a friend who did basically a similar thing where he wanted to capture both the masculine and the feminine in his daughter's name, and so he gave her a slightly more masculine and independent sounding first name and a slightly softer, more feminine middle name. So I think people do try to capture everything with their names if they can.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so one of the things that affects you is names.
Is names.
So what's the next thing under that first triplet?
The next thing is language. So this is similar to names, but it's more about the way we say certain words, the way we choose certain words rather than others. There are some really, really interesting studies that look at how this influences our thoughts. So one of them is, it looks at the way German speakers and Spanish speakers conceive of the idea of a bridge. So if you give someone a picture of a bridge and you say, tell me what you see in this picture, you'd imagine that all people would give roughly the same description. There shouldn't be major differences in how they describe the bridge. Yeah. But it turns out that in German, the word for bridge is feminine, and in Spanish it's masculine. And we don't have a gendered language in English, but obviously Spanish and German are gendered languages. And what you find is that because the Spanish speakers have this masculine word for bridge, they say it's strong and sturdy and robust. Looking at the same picture, the German speakers will say, because they have a feminine word for it, it's elegant and it's beautiful. And so the language that we have, the words we have to describe things, and the concepts that are attached to those words end up shaping how we see the world in pretty surprising ways. That's just one example.
Which is interesting too, because so as a writer and somebody who speaks, I'm kind of obsessed with words and with language, and I've always believed that the language that you use to describe something changes the way that you experience it.
Yeah, absolutely. Another great example that illustrates exactly that point is in eyewitness memory. When people have witnessed a crime, you as a lawyer can shape how they remember that crime. You can actually lead them to misremember it. So there's a very famous study done where people watched two cars colliding, and it was a moderately high speed crash, but there was no glass spilled. None of the windscreens broke or anything like that. But then they were given some of the people were given different words to describe it. So they were told, you just saw two cars smashing, how fast were they going? Or you just saw two cars colliding, how fast were they going? Do you remember there being glass spilled on the road? And if they were told that the cars smashed, they remembered that the cars were going about 10 miles an hour faster, and they remembered that there was glass on the road much more often. So you shape memory, which is fallible.
That's amazing.
Yeah, just by changing one word. It's a very striking effect.
Yeah, which also is concerning because it means that,
It's
I
terrifying,
mean, it's
yeah.
how much can you manipulate people's what they believe in their heart?
Yeah.
You know, is their true memory like this is the way that I experienced it, simply by the prompts, the language that you offer them.
Yeah, it's shocking, especially in the legal domain where a lot of the research is done, because you know a whole case can turn on one minor memory or one minor aspect of the memory, and if it's so susceptible to shifting, it's a major concern.
Well, I guess that's part of the reason. You know, when I went to, I have a past life as a lawyer.
Oh right, okay.
And when I was in school, actually, the Innocence Project, which was sort of like the project that started to focus on DNA as a way to get people out of jail, was started at the law school that I went to, and it was really nascent. And now it's become, you know, like the use of that has become really pervasive. But I guess the fact that they are able to actually get so many people released who have been unjustly imprisoned speaks to the fact that there's a lot, there's a lot of problem around this.
And people want to be accurate. They're not motivated to lie. You know, they're trying to be as accurate as possible. But even with that accuracy motive, they still sometimes are susceptible to these. Well, they're always susceptible to these effects. So it is concerning.
And I guess that's the really like if you hook that same person up to a polygraph and had them tell the story and say this is what I believe happened, it would probably be they truly believe that that's their actual memory.
That's a really interesting advance on the study. I'm not sure they did anything like that, but I'm almost positive that these are genuine beliefs. And so they're 100% certain that that's what they saw, most of them, or at least they're quite confident. Yeah.
Interesting. It makes you think about how you use language all the time.
It does. Yeah.
So we got the first two, names and language. So what's the third in that sort of inside triplet?
The third and the inside one is symbols. So this is sort of the visual analog to written words or spoken words. And symbols are used everywhere. They're used in marketing and branding. They are used in political discourse. They're ubiquitous. So they're everywhere around us. It's impossible to walk through anywhere in New York or in any city where you don't see tons and tons of symbols. And so I was quite curious about the way symbols might influence us. And there are lots of effects. One of the very interesting effects run by some marketing professors looked at what happens when you expose people to the Apple symbol, the Apple computer symbol. And it turns out that they behave or respond by being more creative. So they're better at creative tasks when they see the Apple symbol. Yeah, just because of the associations they have with that symbol, which is quite interesting. And we just process symbols much more quickly than we do words, and much more effectively. So that old saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words is in some sense true psychologically, that we do hoover up that information in a way that we don't words quite the same way. It takes just a little bit more effort and energy to process words than symbols.
And I think what's interesting is I think most people can understand, okay, you see a symbol and maybe it could somehow shape your mood. You know, change you from happy to sad or anxious or to comfortable.
Yeah.
But the notion that, you know, like what you just said, where the Apple symbol literally sort of affecting your cognitive function.
Yeah.
Like your brain, your intelligence on a certain extent, your creativity.
Yeah.
That's counterintuitive, I think, for a lot of people.
I think so, yeah. Just the idea that something so fundamental and low level can be influenced by a symbol that you see. The same is true for other factors like honesty. So if you give people a whole lot of different forms of jewelry to play with, if they are religious Christians and one of the pieces of jewelry you give them is a cross, a crucifix, you find that afterwards if you administer tasks that measure their honesty, they're going to be much more honest. So we found that in the lab a couple of times, that when they look at jewelry that reminds them of their religion, they behave more honestly. But they have no awareness of that. You know, they don't know that that's happening, and yet that's a good thing. They're behaving more honestly, I guess. But the idea that they're susceptible to that effect, I think, is a little bit disturbing.
Right. No, I mean, because again, it's this whole concept of once you understand this map that you're laying out, it gives you a certain amount of power.
It does.
that can be used for good or for evil, depending on the hands of the person who's wielding that information.
Yeah, that's one of the big questions I keep getting about this book is what's the idea here? Are you trying to arm the evil people, or are you trying to give the good people
defenses,
a shield?
Right.
Yeah, and I wrote it initially because I, as a citizen, was just interested in all this research when I came across it. And I wanted to share that information. So I'd like to think of it more as a shield, but at the same time, you can't help sharing this information and then arming people with it as well. So it's certainly a concern.
So let me ask you how you deal with that, though, because it's an interesting question, and I think it's not just about you, but it's about anybody who's out there doing research and experimentation around controversial area where it can be. Where like generally scientists are about the science. They're not very often not about the ethics of application in the real world.
Yeah.
And you put up a certain amount of blinders. You just say like, this is information, this is data that's valuable. But then as a human being who sort of like exists within society, like how do you just live with that, or not live it is the wrong word, but how do you explore that?
Yeah, I think. In the grand scheme of things, the stuff that we're disclosing isn't as grave as what some other scientists might disclose. So we know that there are people who are studying strains of the flu and biological weaponry, and they're releasing all sorts of information that makes it easier for people to get their hands on this stuff. That, I think, the ethical issue is grave. For us, I think it's slightly less grave. I think because it's always a cost-benefit analysis, how much benefit do people get from knowing this versus how much damage are you doing by releasing it? I think the stakes are a little bit lower. I like to think that by enabling people to recognize these factors, the benefits are reasonably high when we release this sort of information and when we study this stuff. But you're right, it is always a concern. Yesterday I was talking to someone and they said, what are the Second Amendment implications of your work? They basically wanted to take it in a gun control direction.
Yeah.
And I try as much as possible to remain agnostic on political issues, but it's very, very tough to do that sometimes. And you always have these ethical issues butting up against your work, so I think it's a good question.
And I mean, as a researcher, it's got to be something that's just always just kind of there in the background. But the other thing is, I mean, you can think about it this way, is that a small percentage of the population already knows this stuff.
Yeah.
And so why not make everybody know it so that it becomes pervasive, so that instead of a small number of people having this ability to wield this power and nobody knows what's going on or how it's working and have no defenses,
right.
Just let everybody know. If you make the information publicly available, and then if you choose not to understand it and learn how to look deeper into what may or may not be happening, that's sort of like your choice to opt out of this knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think leveling the playing field is generally a good thing.
Yeah.
The concern that raises is, are some people, once they have that knowledge, better able to use it?
Yeah, I guess.
But you're right. I think I take some comfort in knowing that once people learn this, if they choose to be more vigilant, they can be. Whereas before reading about this stuff or learning about it, they have no power at all to make that decision. So you are arming the people who are susceptible to it with a shield by doing that.
No, interesting. Anyway, so let's move into that second triplet,
sure.
Which is what's going on between us right now. So that's, what did you call it, interpersonal?
The world between us,
Between us.
Exactly. It's interpersonal and cultural as well. So the interpersonal part, the first of the two chapters, the first two of the three chapters is basically a double. I basically took one chapter and made it into two, and it's about the way we interact with other people. So the first one is about what happens when you are either isolated from other people or when other people are present in your environment. And then the second of the two is about the nature of those people. So does it matter if it's a male, a female, a white person, a black person, so on. So all those characteristics. Some of the most interesting research to me in the book is in that first of the two, which is about what happens when you're isolated from other people. And what's interesting to me is how profound that effect is. So we know that going without food for 24 hours or without water for 24 hours is tough. It's difficult for us. But we're not very good at intuiting how hard it would be to go without human contact if it's not something we've experienced. There's this romantic idea that if you live in a city, you want to get away from it all and be away from human contact. But if you're forced into a situation where you don't have human contact for even a short while, some people, after even 20 minutes of being told they cannot speak to others, flip out. And it's a strong biological need in the same way that food and water are for people. And very few people are capable of going for a long period of time without human contact.
So what are some of the contexts that the research was done around?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the initial research was done in a lab with one of the most famous psychologists in the 50s and 60s, and his name is Stanley Schachter, and he had a number of healthy male subjects come in, and he put each one in his own cubicle, and they had food and they had water, and they had all the things they needed. But for two of them, it took about 20 minutes before they freaked out. And they started banging on the door and they said, "I can't handle this, I don't want this anymore." Another two lasted a little bit longer than that, but they also really struggled with it. And they said afterwards that it was a profound experience, they'd never forget it, which starts to make you think about solitary confinement in prisons.
I mean, that's one of the first things that came to my mind, were people
Yeah.
in there for days or weeks or months.
Exactly. What happens to these people? And I think the sense is that, as with a number of different kinds of torture, we think that the effects are going to be short-lasting. So you remove them from the context and they'll be fine. That's not true. It's not like you can give them food after depriving them of food and they'll be okay. I think when you remove these people from that isolated context, they struggle to come back from it. And some of them, there's been some really interesting work looking at people who have come out of solitary confinement, and for years afterwards they have post-traumatic stress issues, and they really do struggle. You asked about the context. I think the most fascinating one for me was a French adventurer who decided that he wanted to help the space race in the 60s. And so he went and lived in a couple of different caves for a few months at a time. And he had everything he needed. He had magazines and he had food. But he started hallucinating quite quickly, and he felt incredibly lonely. And he documented all this in a book. And he made friends with a mouse. You know, he ended up doing a little bit of what Tom Cruise did in Castaway. You look everywhere for human contact, and you'll find it in volleyballs and in mice.
Right, yeah.
So it's a really interesting effect.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people sense that they would miss people. But one of the things that you shared that is really surprising to me is how little time it takes. I mean, 20 minutes. I would never imagine that not being in contact with somebody for 20 minutes would actually have some sort of detrimental effect on me. It's
very surprising. I think that person was probably unusual because they responded so quickly. But it's part of the idea, and this is true with any form of deprivation, is there's a big difference between self-deprivation, when you say, "I'm not going to eat that, I'm not going to have that bar of candy," and someone imposing that on you and saying you can never again eat this bar of candy, or for the next day you can't eat the candy. Psychologically, having it imposed on you from outside, I think, is a lot more difficult to handle in some senses.
Yeah. Okay, so this brings up another question, which is, do you know if in that study where people in their cubicles, they were told how long that they would be in isolation? Like, was it an open question, you could be here 20 minutes to 20 days? Or was it like, did they have a sense of control over the duration?
They did. They were told you can come out any time, but do your best to stay in here for as long as possible for the research. The longer you can stay in here, the better.
Right.
And so one guy was in there for a week, and he was totally fine. So you do get major individual differences in this.
Right.
You have extroverts and introverts, and people who are just more comfortable spending time alone and occupied with their own thoughts. They could probably conjure the images and thoughts associated with other people, and so that also keeps them feeling as though they have interactions with others, which probably helps.
Did they measure, is there a difference between male, female, ethnicity, culture, stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I wondered the same thing, but so much of the research is done on prison populations which are predominantly male.
Right.
That early research only looked at males, so they don't know that much about it. I don't have strong thoughts about what might happen if there are strong gender differences, but my sense is, if anything, it might even be stronger among women. I'm not totally sure about that, but there's at least a stereotype that women are more affiliative,
more socially oriented.
More social, yeah. And so if that's true, you'd imagine it might be more acute, but I don't have a strong feeling about it either way.
Yeah.
They may also be better able to deal with it than men can.
Yeah. Interesting question, though.
Very.
Next line of research potentially.
Yeah, maybe.
So we start with those in this triplet, and then where do we go?
We go into the types of people that you interact with or come across. So what does it matter if the person you're interacting with is a very attractive woman, for example? And there's some really interesting research looking at this. If you try and think of who might be the most rational group of people that you could possibly think of. A lot of people say, well, chess players are rational. You know, they're very calculating. They think a lot about the different moves they're going to make. And so some economists did some research where they looked at the top chess players in the world, grandmasters. And these chess players were playing tournaments over a series of different years. And they wanted to see what happened to male chess players who are heterosexual males who are playing against very attractive female opponents, and to see whether that might influence the rationality of their decision making.
Right.
And what they found was quite interesting was that the opening move they made when they played against very attractive women had this great evolutionary overhang where they were much more risk-taking. So they made these very flamboyant moves, which may have been sort of way of impressing the women on the other side of the table. Exactly, it's a sort of chest-beating move. But of course the result of that is they either won in spectacular fashion, or they, and this happened much more often, because they abandoned their game plan in the face of this very attractive opponent, they ended up losing much more often. So I think there are some fascinating results there.
Okay. And now the question I have to ask is, was that done in reverse ever?
They didn't check, as far as I know. Well, they checked, and I think they found a weaker effect, but the sample size was a little bit smaller. But quite an interesting effect, I think. Yeah. And so that second chapter is just about all these features that vary among people, differences in race, what happens when we encounter people of different racial groups.
And it's kind of about how that changes your behavior, but also it sounds like your rationality.
Yeah, the way you think, certainly, yeah. I think even before you get to behavior, the move that you make on the chessboard,
it's
the way
like
you're
impulse.
thinking.
It's almost like you don't realize. Like if you ask that person, I wonder, would they realize that they just made a less rational, more impulsive move than they normally would because of the fact that there was an attractive woman opposing them?
It's a great question, obviously, because they were looking at these archival data sets, they couldn't go back.
Yeah.
But there's some evidence that people are not aware of this. So there was another study that was conducted at a skate park, and they were looking at how risky the moves were that these skateboarders were making. And when they had an attractive woman who every now and again would walk by, and whenever she did that, the moves got much riskier. And they found that the males, afterwards, they went up to them and they took a cheek swab to get a sense of how much testosterone was coursing through their bodies. And they found it was a strong biological effect. When the woman walked by, testosterone levels spiked, and so they became much more risk-taking, which was one of the consequences. So there's that side of it. Another factor there is the effect of having loved ones around you. So we know that when you, even just looking at the picture of a loved one during a physically painful experience, helps you to endure and work your way through more pain or greater levels of pain, which I think is fascinating. That just having a picture of a loved one is an analgesic, it's a painkiller, which is pretty phenomenal.
No, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And I wonder what, you take it to the next level, having the person there. Obviously I think that most people would experience that as, okay, I have my loved one with me, I'm better able to handle this, but just the image.
Yeah, it's even the image does the trick. They did some other experiments where people, while they were experiencing pain on the right hand, by either immersing it in a bucket of very cold water or having electrodes attached to them, they were holding the hand of the loved one through a screen so they couldn't see the loved one. And that also had a similar effect. So it's fascinating how these relationships that we form can end up being so powerful that they allow us to endure physical pain.
And I guess it's also really interesting to me, so as an entrepreneur and somebody who advises entrepreneurs and looks at how founding teams are constructed.
Right.
The dynamics of a team, how does this affect the risk-taking of a founder? Based on who else is in the team or the rationality of a founder or co-founders within a team. And then as you grow teams and you have teams within organizations, you're trying to, whether it's a movement or a company, whatever it is.
Right.
How does the basic type or sex of who makes up that team change the behavior and the rationality and the risk orientation of the people in the team, and how would that eventually affect the end outcome of whether it's a successful or not successful venture?
Yeah, actually one other aspect that's related very much to that I found very interesting, that I hadn't researched much before writing the book, was first of all, if you are competing against a small group of people or a large group of people, are you going to be a better competitor? So that's one question. And when you're being watched by people versus competing alone. So if you're in a room far away from people and you're trying to generate ideas for some sales pitch, are you going to be better at that alone, or are you going to be better at that when there are 10 other people in the room watching you do it or helping you? these are important questions, though there aren't simple answers to some of them. So the question of whether you'll be better at a task when others are around, if the task is something that's dominant for you. So if you're an athlete and you're Usain Bolt and you're used to running in front of a crowd and you find that a dominant thing to do, you don't have to think much about it. People tend to do that much better when there's a crowd. When it's something difficult and you're struggling with it, the crowd basically increases your mental arousal and makes it harder for you to focus on the task. So easy tasks, more people good. Difficult tasks, more people not so good. But the question of how many people you should be competing against, if you can imagine a smaller group of people, there's some evidence that you compete better. So students who take the SATs in a smaller room with a smaller group of people do much better than those who take it in a much bigger room. So there's a lot of other evidence for the same effect, that we are better competitors as athletes, as thinkers, when we're in a room with fewer people or when we're surrounded by fewer people.
So then parents should try and figure out ways to get their kids into a smaller group of people when they're taking the SATs or ACTs.
Or even just try and have them think of a smaller subset.
Yeah.
So I sometimes run, and some of the races there are thousands of people, and I'm not a competitive runner, but if I were, it might be useful to think of one or two other key critical competitors rather than being overwhelmed by the size of the field.
Right, and then of course, how does this come into play in terms of class size in schools?
Exactly, yeah. And that's obviously a resource issue as well. It's very tough to have smaller classes, but
I mean, I think if you actually realize that the class size, can actually really affect, a person's performance.
Right.
Not just because they're not getting enough attention, but literally it changes the way that the brain functions within that setting.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe if it's a larger class, find ways to split the class into smaller sections. Maybe even tell the kids, you're going to be in groups for the rest of the year. So this is group 1, this is group 2, this is group 3. And so when they're doing various tasks, they try to think of themselves as part of the group rather than as part of the class as a whole.
Yeah.
All of those sorts of things might help.
Yeah, and organizations too. Same
Organizations, absolutely.
So let's move through.
So the next one is culture, which when you asked me earlier on about my background, I think that some of the research I've done looking at culture has been most influenced by my background. So one of the things I'm very interested in is how many different cultures can one person internalize? And there's a lot of research that says people have a dominant culture, most of us. So wherever you grow up happens to be your dominant culture. Then there's some evidence to suggest that if you live for a long time in one place and then, like I've done, you move somewhere else for a long time, you have two cultures and you can switch between one and the other. But because there's, things have changed recently. There's much more global travel, global business. We get exposure through the internet to all sorts of foreign cultures. So with Virginia Kwan, who is a psychologist, I became really interested in looking at whether we could internalize many, many different cultures. And whether if you activate one culture, suddenly a person who's never lived in some place far, far away ends up behaving like those people from that culture. And this is critical for business. If you imagine someone traveling for business, they might make completely different decisions when they're in China or in Japan or in Australia than they might in the US. And we found pretty good evidence for that. So by immersing people in a different cultural environment, they end up making quite different decisions.
And then I guess my question I keep coming back to with all of this is, would they realize they were making different decisions because of that?
I think you'd have to say no. So one example, we had people who were about to enter a Chinese supermarket and they were asked to make various decisions. And one of the decisions they were making was to predict, first to invest money in fictional stocks, and then also to predict what would happen to the weather over the next few days. And there's some evidence that Chinese people predict much more change in the weather than do people who are who've grown up in a Western environment. And what we found was they were much more likely to, if they hadn't yet been in the supermarket, they behaved basically like Westerners. They didn't predict much change. But when they'd come out of the supermarket, they'd already been inside that environment. Exposure to that environment made them think more like East Asian people tend to think, where they predict more change, more balance, like the yin-yang. When they predicted more change in the weather, they predicted that stocks that had been doing well would then tank, and so they were less likely to invest in those. So there are some very interesting effects there.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
We are more it's just like, we're just not in control of our
I know. That's as you make your way through, you start to come to that conclusion.
I know. You're like, you know what? We do what we can, but there's a whole lot that we can't control. Anyway, so let's kind of like move into that final triplet there.
So the final one is the physical world, the world around us. And there are three separate sections there. One of them is color, and that's where Drunk Tank Pink comes in.
Right.
So I should probably explain the title because it's totally opaque. Yeah. So Drunk Tank Pink is a color. It's this bright bubblegum Pepto-Bismol pink color. And in the 60s and 70s, psychologists realized that it had a tranquilizing effect on people. And they started by painting schools in Canada with a whole lot of different colors, and they found that the schools they painted pink, the students in those schools seemed to do a little bit better. They were calmer and better behaved, less hyperactive. And they then painted some jail cells the same color in some prisons, one in particular in Seattle. And they found that the ones they painted pink, they put some prisoners in there and they were much better behaved and calmer, even if they were very aggressive before going in there. They also then started to publicize this more widely, and some football coaches got hold of it. They started to paint the inside of the visiting dressing rooms, locker rooms, the same color. So the idea was they would obviously pacify their opponents.
Right.
Yeah.
So so can we take color then, and can we use that? Will colors make you more creative or more better problem solving or more intuitive and things like that?
Yeah, there's some evidence of that. Psychologists at the moment are questioning some of the effects that have been shown, and they're trying to replicate them, but the preliminary evidence suggests that the color red makes you more vigilant, so you're better able to detect errors in text. If I gave you an essay with lots of errors and the cover sheet was red, the theory is that you would then go through and find more of those errors than if the cover were blue. But with the color blue, you think more broadly, more creatively. You're more likely to do better on creativity-based tasks rather than vigilance-based tasks.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder if the red also is an association with, like when you were a kid, a lot of times you had teachers marking up the things that need to be corrected with red ink.
Right, and there's actually some legislation in Australia they were trying to pass preventing or prohibiting teachers from using red ink because they thought it was such a negative signal that they should be using red or blue or black ink instead.
Right. So then you should be painting the rooms in businesses or your kids' rooms different colors depending on what you're looking to engender.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So now that I know, like when my kid finally takes SATs, I'm gonna find a way to make sure there's only 5 people in the room.
Right.
We'll make sure that the color is like blue.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And maybe with a little bit of pink around too, so she's calm.
You want the math SAT room painted red for vigilance.
Right, exactly.
And the English SAT room painted blue for creativity.
It'd be so fascinating though to sort of like run that and see how that actually affects. Would it actually affect test scores?
Yeah, and there's some evidence that it does. Yeah.
So interesting. So what else do we have in that final triplet?
So we have locations. So one of the questions is how you should structure various locations for different outcomes. One of the things that I found most fascinating in doing the research for the book is the effects of nature on well-being. So there was some research done at a hospital in Pennsylvania in the early 80s. These people had gone through surgery. They'd had their gallbladders removed, which is now, it's a much smaller procedure than it was then, and most people took about a week to recover. And there was this long wing at the hospital where they were randomly assigned to go into one of the hospital rooms. They were all the same. The only difference was what the view looked like out the window. So the way the hospital was designed, half of those rooms had a view out looking at a brick wall, which is sort of the typical New York view. And then the other half had a small stand of trees. And what they found was nothing was different except for that view, that the patients who had the view of these trees recovered much more quickly. On average, a day more quickly. They needed about 3 times less heavy pain medication just because they had this view of the trees. And of course that's just one isolated effect, but it's been replicated. They've shown that kids who experience stress when they're younger are much better off and deal much better with the stress when they play in a natural environment, when their home is filled with potted plants. Even that stuff seems to matter. So the presence of nature is very powerful.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I know just personally, that's always my solace has always been to just get out and either go walking in the woods or be by the water. It changes my state, but it also changes the way I think.
Yeah, there's some fascinating research looking at water, and that water is supposed to make you more liberal, for example, rather than conservative. There are really interesting effects, and they all are about the nature and how aspects of nature influence us.
Yeah, well, I know definitely, and that's not a huge, of everything that we've talked about today, that's probably the smallest surprise to me just because I've experienced it so personally.
Yeah, a lot of people say that. They say, yeah, of course nature will do that. And I think I think what's surprising is not that it does this, but how powerfully it does it. The magnitude of these effects, because they are massive. I mean, it ends up not making any sense that any major institution wouldn't build a small courtyard with a natural view, or somehow incorporate nature into almost any building that's ever built, because the benefits are so great. It's hard to imagine another intervention that would have quite the same benefits for so little cost.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then again, in my mind, for anybody who's trying to build something extraordinary in the world, build your environment so that there's exposure to nature for you and the entire team.
Absolutely. And I think that's especially true given how urbanized environments are becoming. And we're in one of the most urbanized environments in the world, but in any environment, it just, I think, makes great sense to build that in.
No, I love that. So which brings us to our last one.
The last
weather.
one is the weather, which I think is very interesting, some of the effects. And some of them are not that surprising. So we know that the sun makes you happier than the rain, which is not hugely surprising. But what is surprising, I think, is the flow-on effect of that. So we know also that when people are happier, they just don't think as carefully or as vigilantly. So happiness is a signal. It's sort of an all-purpose signal to the body and to you as a human that things are okay. Whereas negative mood or negative affect, feeling sad or just uneasy, is an all-purpose signal that things are not okay. Something needs to change. Something about the world around you isn't okay, and you need to be vigilant. So based on that, researchers have shown that if you have a little store, and people go into the store and you've put 10 little trinkets on the counter of the store, they go shopping at the store and they look at the trinkets, they are much more likely to remember what they are when they come out of the store on a rainy day than on a sunny day. So the bad weather makes them more vigilant. They're much more likely to pay attention to the stuff that's in front of them, which is pretty fascinating.
So it's like a warning to you. And again, my guess is they're probably not aware of the fact that there's been this sort of state change.
They seem not to know. And when asked about the effect of the weather on their judgments, they say, I have no idea. I mean, I didn't even notice that it was raining or cloudy. But the effects are quite strong.
Which is interesting also because it ties in an interesting way to the work of Barbara Fredrickson, who sort of looks at affect or mood and its effect on intelligence, decision-making, creativity, happiness, and things like that.
Yeah.
And she's got her whole theory is the broaden and build effect, that when you're in a positive mood, it creates a spiral that allows you to literally see more and solve problems in a way that wouldn't be accessible when you're in a negative mood. And if the weather affects that.
Yeah. Well, it's tough to reconcile. I think this is one of the areas where there's a lot of argument and debate in the field. So does positive mood make you think more broadly? Does negative mood make you think more vigilantly? Those two sound like they're inconsistent, so can we put them together? And it's a little bit like the color red versus the color blue argument, that one perhaps makes you think more sharply and more narrowly and carefully. That's the negative mood. But maybe you're liberated to think more broadly and more laterally and creatively when you experience positive mood. So sunshine might do that for you. So maybe it's just about the type of thinking.
So, which makes perfect sense to me. I mean, it's almost like blanking on it, design thinking, the two different stages. But I basically look at, I look at creative thinking in two levels. One is insight or idea problem solving, and the other is production.
Right.
And they're both necessary stages. Like one is like get the big idea, the other is get stuff done.
Right.
And so it seems like these things actually would work on each one of those, but they're both necessary to move from here to a desired outcome. In fact, you need to alternate between them pretty regularly.
Yeah, so maybe the breadth is very important early on, and then you want to be sharper.
Right, and you need to execute on what it is. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm now thinking that I need to be in a beautiful sunny house surrounded by nature on the beach somewhere with lots of trees and people that I love.
Do your taxes on a rainy day when you want to be sharp.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Give them to my accountant, which is even better.
or that, right.
Yeah. It's so fascinating when you look at how hard we work to control our destinies and to believe in our hearts that we have, like, these are the actions that we take, and if we take these actions, this is where we'll be, and this is why we'll be there.
Yeah.
And in fact, there is a lot of, at least I believe that there's a lot of determination based on action, but it's so interesting to also know that there's a world around us. The way that we interact with the environment, the way that we interact with people has a profound effect on the outcomes in our lives.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we are a miraculous species, and I think we we do have great mastery over the world, but the book is supposed to give you the other side of that. That we don't want to get too big-headed about it. We may be doing a pretty good job. We may be able to get to the moon, but at the same time, we are at the mercy of all these sorts of forces that do shape us.
We're still fundamentally primates.
Exactly, exactly.
So the name of this project is Good Life Project. So if I offer that term out to you and ask you, like, what does that mean to you? What comes up?
I think you've summed up a lot of it in some of your responses to what I've said. So I think you can construct the good life, or at least an environment that's more likely to produce the good life, by paying attention to these cues. Nature, using the right colours, all of this stuff, if you capitalize on it, I think basically leads you, or is more likely to lead you towards the good life.
Great. Lots to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the conversation. It's been really enjoyable and very informative.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks. So I'm Jonathan Fields. My guest today has been Adam Alter, the author of Drunk Tank Pink and a professor at NYU, signing off for Good Life Project.